All right, thank you all for being here. So here we go, let's get into it. This is my talk, where to from here. In this talk I'm going to ask a lot of questions and hopefully propose some answers to those questions. The first question is going to be, what does this talk about? The purpose of this talk is to have a bit of an honest appraisal of where we're at as an industry and look at what the opportunities are in front of us and how prepared we are to take those opportunities. So the next question you might be asking yourself is, like, who am I? And I am Philip Mays, this is me, the founder and CEO of Mighty Kingdom. So we're a games company based over here in beautiful Adelaide in South Australia, where I am responsible for this sort of bunch of great individuals. I can see a few of them here in the crowd. And so yeah, so Mighty Kingdom now these days is about 70 people. We've been hiding quietly down over there in Adelaide and quietly growing. But yeah, so we've had a bit of a unique perspective being outside the main sort of ecosystem here in Victoria. But one thing I think we should do before we sort of dive into where we're currently at is have a quick run through of where we've come from. So I'm going to do a brief history of the Australian games industry in one graph, and it's going to be this graph, which is really cool. This tracks the dollar value of the Australian dollar to the US dollar over time, over the last 20 years. And if we go back 20 years, we see in this point here, the Aussie dollar was incredibly low, and that sort of spurred a whole bunch of investment. A whole bunch of these guys turned up with bags of money and started to look at establishing studios here in Australia, and that sort of was the catalyst for a lot of that early growth. And once they came along, we started to get universities and things aligned with pumping out graduates for this industry, and we saw a big growth. So even though we got to this point where the dollar started to get some strength back to it, Australia had sort of established itself as an outsourcing destination for studios all around the world. Of course, you know, with every rise comes a fall. We had the GFC hit in 2008, and that caused a lot of these companies to turtle up. A lot of the contracts dried up. There was a big period of contraction in the industry. But funnily enough, around the same time, we saw this thing turn up, the mobile phone. And so while we may have lost a lot of the big studios, we started to enter this sort of period of sort of regrowth where the next wave of companies started to come out. They were focusing more on mobile and looking at those opportunities where there was sort of a lower barrier to entry. And that kind of brings us to where we are today, where we're still getting back to the highs we had. We're still not quite there yet, but we're seeing a lot of growth and a lot of sort of new opportunity being created in the industry. Yeah, so that was history. So now let's have a look at where we are and compare it back to where we were then. So let's start with the federal government and their support for the industry. So back then, there was nothing, and right now, there's nothing. So, you know, some things never change. We look at the Aussie rate. This is what we were looking at, the exchange rate. That's what the graph was all about. During the heydays, it was around about 75 cents. Now it's about 67. So we're getting to that point where these big US companies are starting to look at us as a destination again, and we're starting to see a lot more interest being sort of coming our way, looking at the talent that we have here. Look at the state support. What did we have back then? Victoria, as the Minister said at the keynote, 30 years of support. We're looking across a 20-year period. What do we have now? Ooh, still Victoria, and it's a little bit of a lukewarm sort of response elsewhere as well. We certainly don't have that sort of depth of support that you guys get in Victoria. You know, we've seen V doing a lot of great work over in Western Australia. We've seen Queensland step up and doing a lot of investment, and just recently South Australia announcing some seed funding for small companies. But yeah, still modest compared to what they're doing here in Victoria. So let's have a look. We've had 20 years of industry support in Victoria, so let's see what that got us. Let's start by looking at where all the companies are. And if we look here, we can see that there were 211 companies. This data comes from Ash Ringrose, who pulled together a lot of information about the Australian industry and where all the companies are and where the people are. So big thanks to Ash from SMG for the data. And if we look at where the companies are, we see 44% of them are in Victoria. So the funding has certainly had the desired result there. And if you sort of break it down by the people, we're up to 48% of the people here in Victoria. Good old SA, sort of punching above its weight there. So, you know, if we look at a little bit deeper though, we see that there are just 3 companies that are actually making up 25% of the entire ecosystem here. We've got Wargaming over in Sydney, we've got EA Fire Monkeys here in Melbourne, and we have Gameloft up in Brisbane. And without them, that sort of takes a big significant chunk out of that wheel. But if we look at that, though, we think that's a success, right? Victoria's managed to attract the companies, attract the people. But if we put that in context, we look at where we were. So back before the big crash in the GFC, we had about 2,500 people working in this industry. Post-GFC, after all the closures, that dropped, and we were down to about 400, 450 at its worst. And we look at where we are now, we're up to about 1,300. But why that feels good, because we can remember what the lows were like. There's still over 1,000 people there who have gone, who have either left this industry and gone overseas, or who have just left the industry altogether. I mean, we have friends in South Australia who have gone on to make beer brewing companies because they couldn't find jobs in the games industry. So while it's a good recovery, it's not as good as it could be, and we need to make sure that we remember all these lost souls along the way. And if we look again more aggressively into the actual company sizes, what we can see is that 55% of all the companies in the Australian games industry have 2 or less employees. And if we look at the average across all studios, we take the total number of employees divided by number of companies. The average is 7. And if we take away EA, Wargaming, and Gameloft, that drops down to about 5. So that's, we've had a lot of consistent funding, but when we start to look at where that has got us, the number of companies that have come out of all this funding that are employing 100 plus people is 0. The biggest companies are owned by foreign publishers. So, right, that's a bit of an uncomfortable truth, but right, we made some good games though, right? Like let's sing the praises. And it's true, we have made some really fantastic games. This is just a smattering that I just pulled out at random, but it could be any number. I had to put a couple of SA ones up there, so shout out to Hollow Knight and Hacknet. But it could easily have been Hand of Fate or Armello or any of these other. There's a lot of few games that have really broken through and had some success on a global stage. So let's have a look at that stage. So how do these games compare globally? Well, if we look over the last 20 years, this is the list of IP that was generated in the last 20 years. Now, I'd consider these billion-dollar IP. These are game series that total lifetime sales would have topped $1 billion, or who have created sort of marketing opportunities in that same scale. And there's a lot of games that you know and you're familiar with. These didn't exist in 1999. They've all just been developed. It's actually chronological, so the further you get down, the more recent they are. And if we look at just one of those games, before I look at one of those games, I'd like to point out that the closest we've managed to get there would probably be something like Fruit Ninja, which had over 1 billion downloads. Has yet to sort of transition itself into like a full-time brand. But that's probably my bet on the one that's got the best chance. Obviously, Untitled Goose Game came out, and everyone's talking about that now. Who knows? It could be $1 billion in geese. But I want to have a look in particular at one game that came out in 2017, which you're probably all very familiar with, this one, Fortnite. So that's only been out for 2 years, right? And if we look at that year, 2017, that financial year to 2018, we find the Australian industry, the entire industry made $120 million, and that took us 1 whole year. So any guesses on how long it took Fortnite to make $120 million? It took 10 days. And to put some global context on that as well, the entire industry globally made $200 billion that year. We captured 0.06% of that revenue as an industry. Yeah, that's good. I like the positivity. Because I guess you might be asking yourself, like, why am I beating you up with all these statistics, right? Why am I sort of trying to drag us down into the sadness that it feels that we're in? The reason I'm doing that is because this is the vision of what we need as an industry, right? We need to have a full ecosystem. Hands up who remembers this slide. Someone asked me to put it in this. Here we go, yay. I presented this a few years ago, and the idea here is that we need to have a full ecosystem of companies in this country. At the moment, what we have looks a bit more like this, where we have sort of random patterns of companies at different scales. And what that means is that when we have a company that fails, it can take out a big chunk of the industry with it. With a full ecosystem in place, a company that closes, there's a lot of opportunities for those staff to go and find jobs elsewhere. We can't sort of expect every company to be a winner all the time. We have to expect that there will be failures, and we have to be able to absorb those as an industry. Otherwise, we'll just be adding to those lost souls that have disappeared. They'll be heading off overseas. They won't be coming back. Even this sort of the forest that I drew here is probably a bit of an exaggeration. There's a few companies that are sort of standing out quite large, and as we saw in the company chart, there's a lot of companies that are, 88% of the industry employs less than 10 people. 88% of the companies. So we've got a lot of work to do to build this ecosystem. It's like, just for another bit of context, there's one studio in Canada that employs 2.5 times as many people as there are employed in our entire industry. And that's not even a company, that's just a studio within a company. So there's some scale here that we can aim for. Another problem that we have at the moment is that the successes that we do have, the games that do break out, are essentially random. Like, there's no clear path we can draw between funding and support and the ecosystem and the success. We still have things like Hacknet and Hollow Knight, again, a couple of great essay games, that essentially come from nowhere and sort of punch above their weight and sort of compete on a global stage. But if anyone could have picked that success beforehand, I'd be quite surprised. The industry isn't random. Like, we know this. Like, if it was random, you wouldn't have big companies like EA, Ubisoft, and Activision. So there is predictability in the market, and we need to figure out how to get that so we can grow our companies and grow our industry in a sustainable way. The next point I'd like to make is that our ambitions are quite modest. I feel like this is a little bit of a hangover from the crash, where a lot of people were burnt by the big publishers. They were either directly employed by them and then let go, or saw a lot of people who were affected by it. And so we sort of reject a lot of the growth and a lot of the sort of ambition that we see overseas. And so there's a lot of studios that get to around 20, 25, and they're quite happy to stay there. Because honestly, the next level is really hard, and it's a lot easier to stay at that scale. The issue there is that at that scale, you can make one game at a time, very well, which means that you're always only one game away from failure, and it's a lot of pressure to put on a company so we need to sort of aim higher. We need to be able to articulate a vision for our industry that gets people excited, because at the moment, the way we're talking and the way we're acting, it's scaring investment away. So to make a game, we need to have a few things, right? We need people, we need an idea, it has to be a good idea, but we need money, right? We need to pay people for a period of time to make games and get it out. Ultimately, we need investment. I've been through this process with Mighty Kingdom. We have 2 investors on board. One of them is from outside the industry, and it was a lot of work to get them to understand what we do, how we do it, what success looks like, what failure looks like. We were basically starting from scratch. So these people are looking at our industry and they're going, I can't predict where the next hit's going to come from. I can't, when I talk to people, they say, oh, I don't want to grow. I'm happy to be where I'm at, make a couple of games. And so we need to change that narrative so that those companies who do want to grow and scale, they have those opportunities to talk to investors and to get the money that they need to hit that next level. The other thing it's doing is it's scaring government away. Like, we had a lot of struggle talking to the SA government when we were 6 people. It got easier at 16, and it's a lot easier at 60. So scale actually brings a lot of momentum behind those conversations. And if we're an industry and we're saying, we're happy to grow, we're 1,300, maybe we can get to 1,500 next year, that's not going to get someone excited to go and put funding behind us. If you're saying we can be 10,000, we can be 20,000, we can be 30,000, that's the ambition that they want to see, so they can actually commit to that and make it happen. So let's take a moment just to chill out after all that, because that was all pretty rough. Can anyone guess what this is? Everyone from Mighty Kingdom will be able to guess what this is. It's New Zealand. It's a beautiful country and you should all visit. So that's where we are, right? So where do we go? This is the crux of what I'd like to talk about for the next little while. So what do we have? We have a strong foundation. Now, it might sound like I've been sort of tearing it down and sort of pointing out all the faults and the holes and the flaws. But if I think back to where we were in 1999, well, I was in New Zealand, but if I think back to where I was 2005 and through the crash and through the recovery, the industry now is a much better place than it was in terms of the diversity of the people that we have in the industry now, the quality of the products that we're creating. The previous industry was built on outsourcing and fee for service and work for hire. This new industry is built on original product, original IP. That's a much better foundation to be building from. It's built on inclusiveness. We're getting more voices involved in this industry than we've ever had before. So I think that this foundation is fantastic. And, you know, it might sound like Victoria, for all their efforts, have ended up with naught, but I think they've ended up with, it was needed. It was the investment that was needed at the time to get the industry through that period. So, you know, while I might, you know, have great ambitions for where we could be, we need to acknowledge that it was a tough time and we did get through. So this is another thing we're doing really well. We're making great games. You know, the list I threw out before, like I say, there could be another dozen games up there, and there's many more we probably haven't even heard of that are sort of outstanding within their market. But what we need to make is great companies. We've got the business, we've got the game development stuff down, we need to get the business stuff down. You know, we need to think about how we grow companies in a way that is sustainable, that creates opportunities for people within the industry. Like I say, right now, if somebody wants to take that next step in their career, if they reach that point where they want to work on a AAA or a big sort of large-scale production, there's no opportunity for them in Australia. We need to change that. We need to stop those people looking elsewhere. We need to stop them exiting the industry. We need to keep them here. And to do that, we need to grow great companies that can make big products successfully. And for this, I think we need to look at what other industries have done and how they've scaled. You know, we've just heard recently Culture Amp, which is based here in Victoria, in Melbourne as well. You know, the latest sort of billion-dollar startup. We've had Atlassian, we've had Canva. These are tech companies based in Australia that have gone on to become giant companies employing thousands of people and operating all around the world. Now, these people are here. You can talk to them. Like, we should talk to them and see what they do, see how they think, and bring some of that thinking back into the game industry. We like to think that we're very different in a lot of ways, and in some ways we are, obviously. We're making creative products. We're basically, you know, in the entertainment industry. But we need to look at what other industries are doing and how they solve these problems that we're coming across, and not to sort of believe that we can do it ourselves. You know, at Mighty Kingdom, we take the view that while we make games, we are an entertainment company. So we look at what other entertainment companies do. You know, you can look at, obviously, Activision, EA, the big guys, but we look further. We look at what Disney's doing. We look at how they can create a product, create a brand, create a film, and build the entire ecosystem around it. One thing Ella likes to say is, like, she looks at a game pitch and says, how can this be a theme park? Like, what's the ride that I can do for this? Like, this is how Disney operate, right? And this is the sort of thinking we need, that sort of ambition, that scale. One thing we also need to do is we need to realize that our actions and our inaction affects others. So even if, you know, your company doesn't exist in a vacuum, you don't exist in a vacuum. The choices that you make will affect others in the industry. The advice that you give to people, that helps inform opinions that are then sort of parroted around. So, you know, even though you might not be interested in investment and growing your company, you should, if someone rings up and wants to talk about it, you should take that call. You should have that talk. And even if you're not the person who wants to do it, introduce them to someone who does. And I know it's like a pain because no one likes talking to investors because trust me, they're an interesting bunch. They look through a very particular lens, but it's worth educating them because it'll benefit the industry as a whole. It also means that if an opportunity comes up that you don't like, you know, Mighty Kingdom was built on the back of kids' games. We got that project because 2 other companies in Australia passed on it, and we were able to take that and turn that into, you know, a multi-million-dollar success. And so if those companies, you know, we were lucky in that we had connections to them, and so that landed in our lap. But we should be doing that for everyone. We should be looking to, every company here generates opportunities, right? You might be an original IP house and you're not looking at doing work for hire. But as soon as you get your name out there, people will be ringing you up, offering you stuff. And if you just hang up the phone and don't take that call, you're stopping an opportunity from someone else, because they won't go around ringing other Australian companies, they'll just look elsewhere. So take those opportunities to bring that stuff to Australia and keep it in Australia. I have a little quote here from a politician, funnily enough, who once told me that everybody wants things to get better, but nobody wants anything to change, right? And which I thought was actually quite insightful for a politician. And so I think, like, if we just keep doing what we've done, we're always going to get what we got, and that's probably not enough. And yeah, like I say, if you don't want to grow, if you listen to all this and you think, you know what, growing's scary, I don't want to do that, it's too hard, why did I sit in this talk? Then find someone who does and help them and support them through mentoring, through talking, share your advice. A lot of people here have been in the industry for a long time. You've seen a lot of things, you've done a lot of things. Pass that knowledge on to others so that they don't hit the same walls that we hit, that they can stand on our shoulders. Hey, that's a theme from last year. Stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And so then they can take those next steps. We're in a unique place in this industry. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not winner takes all. We can all win, right? Like Untitled Goose Game comes out, does incredibly well. That doesn't mean people stop playing Shopkins, right? Right? I hope not. But no, so you know what I mean? It's like we're in a position where we can all take advantage of this. There's nothing to be lost other than time by passing this stuff on. So I don't know if there's any government people in the room, but I'm going to switch into the government mode. No one wants to admit it anyway. So one thing we need to talk about is government support. And for our industry to grow to the scale that it needs to get to, this is essential. It's an essential ingredient. As developers, we can certainly play our part in helping change that conversation. Because if we ask that question, how good is government support? This guy is pretty good, eh? Right? This is an example of what effective government support can do. Let's go back in time to 1999. Here we are. That's Canada. It looks like a weird dog, pig thing, but it's actually Canada. We both had about 1,000 people in our industry. Maybe it's just me. It's like a Rorschach test. We actually started off at about the same point. We had about 1,000 people. This is all kind of airy-fairy numbers, but you get the idea. 2009, look at this. We're up to about 2,500 people. This is around about our peak. It's not quite then, but that's okay for the purposes of this. And now we get to 2019. Look at that, 21,800 people. In those 20 years, they've grown their industry by 22 times. We've done ours by like 1.3. So that's, yay. And you might think, okay, they've got a population advantage. Yeah, we're like 20-something million, they're 30-something million. But over that exact same period of time, we grew by the same amount in terms of population. We grew by about 6 million, they grew by about 7. So it's not like we couldn't have got the same results in that same time. So when it comes to government support, we've done bottom-up support. We've got all the foundation in place. We've got the grants in place. We've got those things that will help companies get established and take that leap to start developing a product, but we need top-down support. We need to go and we need to attract those big companies. We need to get one of those big 3,000 plus person studios and attract them and bring them here to Australia. And that's going to be scary, right? Like, because we're at the bottom. We are the bottom at the moment. And so when we think about bringing an EA the EA is already here, but if we think about bringing a Ubisoft or someone here, it can be scary because we think, look, they're going to come here, they're going to take all my staff, they're going to be doing all this really, really crazy cool stuff. How am I going to compete with that? Well, the problem at the moment is that even if you think you're not, you are, because those people who are looking for those roles will just leave your company and go overseas to take them. What we want to do is keep those people in Australia so that when they figure out that it's just as crazy and difficult as it is working in a small studio or as a big one, they'll leave and they'll bring that experience back to a new Australian studio. Canada didn't start, they had the bottom, they came in at the top, and that's filled the gap in between, right? So it creates opportunities for companies of all scales. So it doesn't destroy opportunity when you bring a big studio in, it actually creates more. And as a game company, if you can't compete on salary, there are other ways you can compete as well. There's the work balance that we have in our studios, the culture that we can create. We can differentiate ourselves from those big studios. It's not all about money. As anyone who's worked in the industry long enough will know, Money's one thing. Money's great. It allows you to do lots of really interesting things. But it's not the most important thing, right? You've got to spend 8 hours a day working with a bunch of people. That matters, right? Like the keynote that we saw yesterday talked about one of the most important things to her in her career now is who she works with. And we can control that to a degree. But yeah, so, we should look at, what else we got here? We should be talking to our industry bodies, our reps, IGEA, who I see Ron's over here, and the GDAA. We should be getting them, empowering them to take this approach. We shouldn't be scared of it. We should be advocating for it because it will create more opportunity for all of us ultimately. It's also important for state governments, right? Like one of the reasons that Canada succeeded as much as it did is they had federal support, but the states competed against each other. You look at what Quebec has done and how much they've managed to capture. And so, at a state level, doing nothing is not an option as well. We need to petition our state governments because whoever moves first in this market, whoever captures this first, will capture the bulk of that return. So you've got to, not just all federal. So, why is this all important right now today? So we're kind of in a very interesting moment in the game industry. And if I sort of track a little bit of how we got here, it sort of started with this, Xbox, Game Pass, you pay some money, subscription, you get some games, quickly followed by PlayStation Plus. EA jumped on the bandwagon, they got their own Origin Access, EA Access as well. Ubisoft have announced their own subscription platform. Epic has come out with a game store now where they're competing against Steam and disrupting that market. Apple is now, getting their own subscription service and they've got their own games. Google and whatever the hell Stadia is like also like, I have no idea. But anyway, but what do all these platforms want, right? What are they after right now? They want content. They want exclusive content. There's a bit of a, I wouldn't call it a gold rush because that's probably a bit of a strong word, but there's a sense in the industry right now that there's a good 18 to 24 month window where we can really take advantage of this. These people, I write content, but they oftentimes want exclusive content as well. They want things that you can play on Xbox that you can't play anywhere else, or whatever. And like, if this feels familiar, it's because it's happened before in a very adjacent industry. You might recognize this, right? Netflix, right? They created this streaming platform, the streaming service. I mean, there's like since Netflix came out, there are hundreds of them now, right? Like every person who's got a TV show has got their own streaming platform. But to give you some context of what Netflix did to the film industry, in 2018, which is my favorite year to pick, they spent $13 billion on new content, right? And we haven't quite got to those numbers yet in gaming, but we see some big numbers thrown around for what Apple's doing with Arcade. There's big numbers thrown around for what the Ubisoft and the rest are looking to do to establish a set of content that you can only get through their platform. This is an opportunity for us to sort of try new things, to establish new brands, to sort of take some risks in an environment where there's publishers and there's platforms that are willing to take the monetary risk on our behalf. But there will be winners and there will be losers, right? Like, not every platform is going to survive. Not every game idea is going to fly. We need to make sure that we have that ecosystem in place so that if there are failures within this environment, that we can support them. We can help those companies survive through those lean times, help those staff find new pathways back to the industry. But beyond that as well, if you are a winner, if you do win, we should be investing that back into the next generation. And again, this comes back to, it's not just money, although money is very important. And again, looking at other adjacent industries, look at the tech industry. They do this really, really well. I went through a business incubator in Sydney called Startmate with another business. I won't go into it right now. But it was fascinating in that it was founded by a bunch of tech entrepreneurs who'd made a lot of money in the early sort of dot-com days. All Australians, they'd all moved overseas. They'd all come back. They all put money together and invested in the next wave of tech companies. I can't remember how many of them have come through that system now. but that led on to Blackbird Ventures, which is a venture capital firm over in Sydney, and they manage billions of dollars in their portfolio now. And so that's just an example of how you can reinvest back into the ecosystem and then see increased gains for all of them. I'm pretty sure Blackbird was an investor in Canva as well. So we should be looking at those lessons, and we shouldn't, I mean, it's nice to drive a Tesla. That's what everyone drives now, right? Or live in a big house, but we want to be able to create those opportunities for others as well. We want to, it doesn't take a lot, as we've seen with grant funding. The right amount of money at the right time can mean a lot to a company and can sort of really set them on the right path. But if it's not money, then you've got advice, connections, a lot of experience that you can share as well. And ultimately, that's what StartMate was about. There was some funding, there were some things around it, but it was ultimately about talking to a bunch of people who've been through the grinder and come out the other side and succeeded, and learning from them, taking what works, discarding what doesn't, and going to that next stage. Man, I'm going through this very quickly. This is probably very important. I think for a long time, our industry has been focused on survival and on getting to the next stage, getting to the next, the next quarter, getting to the next year, getting to the next paycheck sometimes. But it's not enough for us to just survive. We have to thrive, right? We have to have a big, exciting, dynamic, diverse industry here that's built on the foundation of original product. It's built on the foundation of inclusivity and of diversity and those things. We need $1 billion IP. I said that before. We should be generating that sort of stuff here in Australia. There's no reason we couldn't. We have the talent. We have the skill. We have all the ingredients here. We need government support to do it. We can't do it without it. We need a government. We need to work as an industry to get them across the line, to understand what the potential here is and what we can be. We need to keep that talent here in Australia. And we need to keep reinvesting back into the ecosystem so that it grows and gets stronger every year. Because the rest of the world isn't waiting for us. If we don't do this, these opportunities they're not going to sit around waiting for us to get ready. They're going to go somewhere else. And if we don't act quickly, that's exactly what will happen. This is a $200 billion industry at the moment. Who knows where it could be? People bandy around very big numbers when it comes to the game industry. And ultimately, the last question I want to ask, and oh my God, I'm way ahead of time, is when we look back in 20 years, what do we want to see? Do we want to see that we missed this opportunity, that we were happy just to stay in our little cottage industry, or are we looking at this as a starting point of something big? And are we looking at this as the catalyst that got us to grow and get back to those heights and higher than we were before? And that's actually all I have, which is crazy. So I did ask a lot of questions in that talk, and I answered some of them, but I'm happy to hear from you guys and take your questions as well. How do you guys feel about that? There are some, I mean, there's some uncomfortable truths there, but I'm interested to hear you guys take.
So maybe to start the questions with some positive. So where do you see Magic Kingdom in 20 years?
Magic Kingdom is a bit of a slip of the tongue because that's Disney, but
Mighty Kingdom.
We've had a very strong growth mindset with Mighty Kingdom from day dot. We have a mantra that we throw around internally called "Bigger than Disney," and we think about that in terms of looking at what they do and how they capitalize on the IP that they generate. So for us, the future is in the short term is games. It's on building on the successes that we have and taking steps into what we would say is IP generation or brand creation. And then the future is to leverage that into other medium beyond games. And then ultimately, bigger than Disney. If we can get to a point where we can have, okay, now I'm starting to get a little bit maybe out in the reeds, but when I look at what Activision, EA, and those guys are doing, I see a missed opportunity that they haven't been able to take the successes that they've seen in gaming and translated them elsewhere. And we've seen Ubisoft sort of take a play with Assassin's Creed, and they're looking to establish that as a platform, and now they're building a film production studio in-house to bring that in-house. That's the sort of steps I think the next step of the industry will be, is becoming an entertainment juggernaut, right? Like, look at what Disney does with, you know, like Star Wars, for instance, right? It's like industry-leading games, industry-leading films, industry-leading, like, the comic books are great, the toys are great. It's like, this is where we want to be, right? For us at Mighty Kingdom, like, that's where we would like to be eventually. It's a long way from here. So we do have a very long-term vision of what we're trying to grow. But it all starts with making great games. You've got to make great products, right? So we're very much focused on that at the moment. And yeah, doing that with a strong focus on customer, which is why these other companies win, right? And but also on culture, on our people, making sure we're creating an environment that allows those sort of ideas to grow. Yeah. Job applications are just over here, by the way.
So you mentioned government support being a very crucial part of growing the industry. Now, as someone from Sydney, I'm quite aware of the, for lack of a better word, apathy that like our government and also to the federal government. I don't want to get too biased, but I think maybe it has something to do with the more conservative side of politics that don't necessarily understand what we do and like the value of what we do. My question is, well, first of all, was when you were applying for like the grants through South Australia, was that when the current Liberal government was in?
Well, just to be clear, we've never. Oh, actually, no, we did. God damn it! I was going to say we've never received any grant funding from the government.
Oh, right. Sorry.
It came quite late in the life cycle for us, but we were able to, around the time we set up Game Plus, which is the sort of co-working space in Australia. We've got some funding from that as well, but that was a Labor government.
Okay.
We have a Liberal government now, but. It's an interesting question, right? Because I'd say as an industry, we're very, very left-leaning.
Yeah.
We're all very, I mean, how many people were at the climate change rally, right? Like, yeah, come on. I mean, we're all pretty woke here, right? But but if we want to see success, it can't be politicized, right? It can't be seen as a Labor thing or a Liberal thing. It just seems to be seen as a good thing.
Yeah, because like what I was actually trying to get to was like what I know, like how do we appeal to those in government who may have a bias against us? Like, it's kind of seemed like a bit of an uphill battle. Like, what do you think we should be wary of when we're going to like try to get that money, get that support from essentially people who may not necessarily have our best interests at heart?
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, they kind of do, but they do it through a weird ideological lens, right? And you know, I'm very lucky in that I have a loud American guy who does a lot of this work for me. But I mean, he's a very left-leaning Liberal guy as well. Like the actual word of Liberal, not the what it means here in Australia. But you know, for a while there, he would come back to work and he's like, "Oh, I need to have a shower after speaking to politicians," right? But like ultimately, they're just people, right? And they may be ideologically different to you, and there might be some fundamental differences that you have. But you've got to find that common language, and you've got to find the levers that they want to see pulled. Like for us in South Australia, for a long time it was jobs, right? It was all about jobs and growth. And so if you can articulate through that lens, then that will get them excited and get them interested. You know, sometimes it's about education, and then it's about, okay, you know, you'll see sometimes there'll be a crisis of like, we have all these graduates, what are they going to do? And then you can say, they can all get jobs in my industry. And so you can sometimes leverage the things that they're worried about and sort of show how your industry can be a solution. One thing that we found very effective is if you talk about what the game industry is and how uniquely positioned it is within a wider ecosystem, it can really help as well. Like we talk about how the skills that we have in the game industry in SA are relevant to the defense industry, relevant to visual effects industry, which are two sort of really big growth industries in our state. So look for those sort of adjacent industries as well and use that to sort of piggyback. Because what they don't want to see is like, oh, we put $1 here and then it just goes away. But if you can show how there's like second order and third order effects and how that sort of grows. But ultimately it's like, you know, investing, and ultimately it's an investment, right, that the government's making in the industry. And like any investment, like any project that you get, it's about relationships, and it's about building those relationships with those people, treating them as human, you know, even though sometimes all evidence may be to the contrary. But just getting to understand them, what what they like. One of the ministers that we have a very good relationship with was a cabinet maker. Like my dad was a cabinet maker. So it's like you can find those bridges to get through the ideology and just get to the core of who they are. And then once you get those advocates in place, give them good ammunition. Don't make things up. Like only say things you're going to deliver, and keep delivering it. And then you build that track record, and then they'll be silly not to support you.
Thank you.
Oh, I ran past Jules. Probably a good call.
Thanks for advertising New Zealand as well.
It's a beautiful thing.
As an economist and an entrepreneur and a government advocate career before entering game school, it's really, what I see is that there is a really great system for churning out, say, 3D artists and coders and stuff like that, but nobody seems to be really thinking about the sustainability of an industry, or teaching anything about that. Like you actually have to make games that people want, not you, like people not like you might want. So you've got a very, well, in my class it's 90% 20-year-old males, and so they have a particular focus on the kind of games. And I'm going like, well, there's these markets out there, but it's not about, there is an ideology about I want to make the game that I want, and it's a very purist thing. And nobody's kind of going, well, the reality is, if you want to have a sustainable industry, there's cash flow, there's markets, there's
yes.
Research, there's budgets, there's applying for funding, there's all those things are not covered in the curriculum that I'm currently studying. And so there's no school for what you're talking about. I guess in terms of upscaling to that 20,000.
There's a school of hard knocks.
Yeah. So you have to do it the hard way. But is there a way of, I guess, thinking of a kind of a nursery, if you like, for people that want to build those companies that you talked about, the companies that are bigger than just the risk averse, mum and dad company that really does make one game at a time. So what's the process for getting?
That's a big question. That's a huge question. I think just to get back to the thing about the making the games, right? There's sort of like a combat that you have between the ego and the id, right? Like quite often the decision to get up and say I'm going to make this game and it's going to be like this, that's a very ego-driven decision. But like you say, your game is for a market, it's for players. It has to be played by people. We made kids games. We're not kids. What do you do? So you find tools and you find ways of being able to understand that audience and bring their voice into the process. So there's data is a great one, right? Data tells you a lot about what your players are doing, because oftentimes you're not the target audience of the game you want to play. Occasionally it overlaps and it's great, but the reality is you'll be making games for someone else's vision or some other audience that's not you. So you need to get your ego out of the way a lot of the time and just kill your darlings, as Kimbo likes to say, and be able to sort of understand when you're doing things just because you want to do them, and are doing things because it's better for the product and ultimately your players. For the education angle, so I went to media design school in Auckland. I don't know if that's where you're at. Yeah, there you go. I was in the first cohort there. But that's an interesting one, right? I think that the trap is to go, okay, how do we, how can we make game developers understand business? Well, guess what? There's an entire school at university called the business school. Right? They know how to do this. I think that the trap is to think that we're different from other industries, right? There's like Tony, my COO, has a MBA, right? That's great. Those are sort of skills and stuff you can leverage. It brings a lot of perspective in, and the trick is sort of understanding which parts are relevant and which parts aren't, and that just comes with experience. And so to that end of it, we need to talk to the people who have done it, who have got there, and seek their advice. I think too often, we, as game developers, we focus on the product. We think that's the most important thing. We think if we just make a really good game, then people will find it and we'll succeed. And it's not, a lot of the smaller companies I speak to, it's not until they're very close to the end that they're like, oh shit, how are we going to market this? How are they going to find this? You need to be thinking about those things right from the start. And it's tough because, right, you want to make a game, you want to be coding, you want to be. I was a programmer once. I haven't written a line of code in many years now, which is kind of sad. But you have to make that decision, right? You need to step away from part of that, of your role, and you need to start looking at the harder problems to solve. And I think we do this a lot, right? We just sort of avoid these things because they're very hard, right? We want to believe that the industry will reward good work. but it doesn't, right? The stats don't back that up. There are thousands of new games coming out every day, and they just get buried, right? So it's like you've got to have a good game. Every successful games company has great games, right? That's just the reality of it. But they also have great marketing. They have a great social, you know, they have great, you know, all these other things. You look at what, you know, like Ubisoft and these guys can churn out great game in year after year after year after year. How do they do that? Like, these people are there. You can talk to them and you can understand how they do it. Obviously, they can do it they're doing it at a scale that's not quite where we are now, but there are lessons there we can take and we can learn from it. So if you're at university, I'd say pick up some business papers. Like, start taking things outside, take electives outside of game development, and start looking at how other industries are doing it and how they're solving it. Uh-oh.
Why? Oh.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was going to be Julian, but no.
Oh.
Rain, you're cool.
So you talked a little bit about how someone who doesn't want to grow their studio can help other studios do that. Can you talk about that some more? Like, I'm in a position where I'm not in a position to grow a studio right now. I don't have my own studio. And yeah, even when I do, I don't think I could.
I can see you sitting next to you.
Wow. So what can I do to help the industry?
Well, I think you're doing it already, Ren, which is great. You know, part of that is coming to conferences like this and talking and sharing what you do and how you do it, because that just, like I said, it helps someone avoid a mistake or a problem or just wasted time, right? Like, ultimately, the one resource that we can't get more of, like, we can get more people, we can get more money, we can get all these other things, but we can't get more time. And so anytime we can help a company save time by making, you know, or an individual, like, by shortcutting all those poor decisions, that's fantastic, right? So that's like step one. You know, I think we need to get better at mentoring, and this is what was in the keynote last night as well, yesterday as well, which was really fantastic. And mentoring isn't just about the skills, right? It's about I find a lot of the stuff that I do is talking just about how to approach problems, right? How do you solve a problem that comes in front of you? Like, what's the process that you go through? You know, how do you remove the emotion and the anger and all that sort of stuff from a problem and just look at it objectively and make a good decision? And that's not game development. That's just life, right? So it's like, you know, sharing those sort of lessons as well. And, you know, it's tough. Like, sometimes we don't want to do it because we just want to be at home and watching Netflix or you know, or doing these other things. But the payoff is worth it in the long run, right? And so I think continue doing what you're doing, keep talking, keep traveling around the world and seeing people from different cultures and seeing what they do and how they do it, and bring that stuff back, share it with your community. And I think that's about as much as we can ask for anyone. Here he goes. Got there. It's a lot of build-up.
Thanks, Phil. So you talk about content.
Yeah.
With Netflix, a lot of their content is middling content. They're not all Stranger Things. A lot of it is just
Some
rubbish.
even Stranger Things.
Yeah. How can Australian industry embrace that kind of middle tier of games to go to fill out their?
You're pushing a button, aren't you? Well, we used to be, because we worked on a lot of mid-tier stuff, right? That's what
Yeah.
we used to do. Yeah, I think like when the Wii came out, it created this mid-tier of content, right? And then the phone came out and sort of blew that away. So it's all kind of in a bit of a weird spot now. Mobile is maturing at a rate where it's now the production costs on it are getting up to what we'd consider sort of that bottom end of console development. So like you might consider that content middling content for Netflix, but what they do is they use a lot of data to figure out who their audience is and what they're engaging with. So they're using data to identify segments or niches. And even though we might not like that content ourselves, there is a significant number of people. They've got like millions of subscribers, right? So they can get a lot of views. I say like what we're looking at right now is, I wouldn't call it middling content. I would call it more like experimental. Like, it's an opportunity for us to try things. Like you'll find in the industry that there's like trends and patterns. Like, you know, like a Candy Crush comes out and suddenly everyone's making match 3 games, right? And then Clash of Clans comes out and everyone's making like, you know, war games. And okay, Fortnite or PUBG comes out, I should say, because hey, let's acknowledge where it started. And then you're saying everyone's making a battle royale game. So like you got to, I'd look away from the trends and look at what's not trending, because those where the opportunities usually are. Hacknet was a great success because no one had made a game like that at any scale before. You know, we're talking to a guy from Funcom about Conan Exiles. You know, they looked at the market and they were like, what's hot right, you know, look at Steam, what's top 10, and they went through different categories and they looked at the top 10 games in each category. And if the number 10 game is like a 10 million seller, probably don't go to that category. But they found that in online sort of survival games, the number 10 game had sold like 250,000 copies. And so like, there's an opportunity there for another player to come in and get into that market. So use that data to find those opportunities. Now, and your partners will help, your platform partners will help identify those segments as well. But I mean, that's what we do. Go to the data, right? Look at the data. I don't know if that answers your question. Is it good? Cool. That was actually the last question, Jules. So thank you all. I'll be around if you want to talk more about where things are at and how awesome we can be. So yeah, thank you all.